Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and I'm delighted to welcome you for this afternoon's virtual program, Hollywood's Unofficial Film Corps, with Michael Berkowitz. Before we get started, a few little household items to talk to you about, which is that your audio and your video will be muted and off throughout the program. We welcome questions. You can send them to us via the question panel at the lower right of your screen. We ask that you keep them short and refrain from comments so we can try to get to all of the questions this afternoon. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Berkowitz. Michael is professor of modern Jewish history at University College London. His recent monographs include Jews and Photography in Britain and The Crime of My Very Existence, Nazism, and the Myth of Jewish Criminality. He has held fellowships from Linda Hall Library for History of Science, Technology, and Engineering, Kansas City, the Science History Institute in Philadelphia, the Remarque Institute at NYU, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Washington, D.C., and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. He's the author of the recently released Hollywood's Unofficial Film Corps. Welcome, Michael.
All right. Lisa, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, it's always better to be in person, but this really fits the situation. I wanted to begin by dedicating this talk to a couple of colleagues. First of all, David Mazauer, who has been incredibly vibrant and active in the life of the Yiddish Book Center, dear colleague and friend, originally from London. Also to another dear colleague and friend who's been active with you as well, Irving Massey, who I'm sure is familiar to a lot of your audience. And I'd also like to dedicate this presentation to the honor and memory of my dear friend Seth Wolitz, who died not that long ago. And in the question period, if anybody wants to, say something about any of these wonderful figures, happy to talk. Okay, let me begin with this subject for today, which is the book. I never thought I'd be writing a book about the movies per se, but in 2014, I was working on a subject I'd been working on for quite a long time. That is the subject generally of the engagement of Jews in photography. And I was very fortunate to have a fellowship at a wonderful place, the Center for Creative Photography in Tucson, Arizona, at the University of Arizona. And I was reading in the papers of John Gutman, who came to the United States as a German Jewish refugee. And one of the things that he said about his career, that is, he wound up joining the U.S. Army Signal Corps. He worked as a photographer, and he's mainly known as a still photographer. But one of the things he said was, I did mostly still photography, but I also shot motion picture film. And I thought this was kind of interesting. Again, he said he shot motion picture film. I think maybe he did a quick check, couldn't find anything at all. A few years later, again, that was 2014. In 2016, I was working at Yad Vashem, again, still on the same subject of the engagement of Jews in photography. And at this point, I had assumed, and it turned out to be, I think, correct, that there was a very large number of Jewish men working in the U.S. Army Signal Corps during the Second World War and its immediate aftermath as photographers. And I kept seeing references to having shot motion picture film. And so finally I thought, gee, maybe I should start recording this a little bit more meticulously. Again, it kept coming up at Yad Vashem. And then after Yad Vashem, again, very fortunate, I had a fellowship at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I kept finding more references like this, that is about these photographers, and finding absolutely nothing at all about the work that they had done as motion picture photographers. So I went to talk to a couple of archivists in Washington at the Holocaust Museum and elsewhere. And they said they really weren't sure, how to find it. But one of them suggested that I start looking at the film that was available in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. That is, and I believe there was something like 700 or 900 some pieces of film that were attributed to the United States Army Signal Corps. So I did what a very boring, old-fashioned historian does. I watched the film. I wrote down all of the references that were available. In some cases, there were very few references. And I thought I would try to figure out what is going on. And they hardly ever had the names of photographers or who was actually doing the filming. So because I was in Washington, I was able to go to the National Archives in College Park, and I started trying to track down all of these references. And what I found was a really incredible story. That is, with the guiding thread being the United States Army Signal Corps, and I wound up finding things from other branches of the service, including Navy, Air Force, Marines, even Coast Guard. I found that there was an incredible story about film during the Second World War that I didn't see reflected in the historiography. And the major figure in that story happened to be Leo Rosten. And that's actually what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about Leo Rosten probably for most of my time here. First of all, let me say, and I'm going to quote something from the really great obituary that appeared in the New York Times by Margaret Fox, really, really excellent. And then I also want to say at the outset that Rosten's career in film, but up to the point that I talk about, has been talked about really, really well by my dear colleague, Steve Carr, in Indianapolis, Indiana, and Purdue University in Indianapolis. And he has a fabulous book on Holocaust, on Hollywood and anti-Semitism. Does a great job with Rosten's earlier career, which I'm going to be speaking about here. So again, as it turned out, Rosten was a major figure in how the whole film program was conceived and even how it was executed, despite the fact that there's been a lot of attention paid to the program through the 5 major directors, that is, through the work of Mark Harris, and people know these names. That is Frank Capra and George Stevens and John Ford and John Huston and William Wyler. Again, 5 came back. These great figures discussed by Mark Harris, also a nice Netflix series on this, kind of interesting. William Wyler was the only Jew among them. Rosten, obviously Jewish, and as it turns out, most of the figures I was finding who were sort of into the kishkas of the movies and really, really instrumental were basically these Hollywood Jewish guys. But I think before I go much further, I want to say a little bit about Rosten explicitly. And actually, I'm gonna quote from the obituary, if you don't mind, because it's actually really great summary. It begins by saying, Leo Rosten, the writer, scholar, and language maven who introduced millions of Americans to the deep lexical pleasures of chutzpah, shlemiel, kibbutz, and nosh, died yesterday at his home, age 88. Okay, so the point is that Leo Rosten, for people of my generation and a little bit older and a little bit younger, is a really well-known figure. That is, he's the author of The Joys of Yiddish. He's the author of The Education of Hyman Kaplan. He's basically a humorist. Scholars in the world of film know of his work in film. Most others, I think, really haven't really paid that much attention to it. But just to read one other line from, as I said, really excellent obituary by Margaret Fox. During World War II, Mr. Rosten held a variety of government positions including Deputy Director of the Office of War Information and Chief of the Office of War Information's Motion Picture Division, and in the later 1940s worked for the Rand Corporation. Okay. The reason why Rosten was so important is because he was actually the first director of the film division of the Office of Facts and Figures, which actually predates the entry of the United States into World War II very soon after Pearl Harbor. That is, he was put into this particular position, and this division, this Office of Facts and Figures, is regarded as not really that impactful, not really all that important. But I would argue, and I have argued in this book, that it was really important from the perspective of film, that is, from the kind of initiatives that were launched by Leo Rosten. Okay. Let me say a little bit more about Leo Rosten without going into great detail, and I won't say anything much more here about Joys of Yiddish and sort of why many people, I'm sure, who are on board already are familiar with him. He was born in 1908. He died in 1997. He came as a young boy from Lodz with his family, and they came to Chicago. I mean, sometimes he's described as working class, but his family weren't exactly schleppers. They wound up being able to establish a knitwear factory. I mean, not super wealthy, but what this means is that Leo Rosten had a chance to go to college. He went to the University of Chicago, and he was a smart boy. He did well. He was really interested in a particular subject, as it turned out, that was really only being focused on at a couple different institutions. That is, the University of Chicago and Columbia at the time. That is, he got really interested in how public opinion is shaped. So he goes to Chicago, and then he goes to graduate school. And sometimes it's said that he was in political science. That's not quite true. That is, Chicago being Chicago, and the way that it was organized, it meant that he was actually in a rather interdisciplinary program that was hard to define. And this is part of the reason why his career ends up being so highly unusual. Okay, he goes to Chicago to graduate school. He does what he's supposed to do. And he decides he is going to write about the Washington Press Corps and the shaping of public opinion. And he goes, he's doesn't take him very long. He's finished with his PhD within 7 years, which is, well, pretty good at University of Chicago. And he publishes his PhD almost immediately, gets no job, nothing at all. So he ends up teaching night school. And this experience teaching night school is well known. This is what becomes his first novel. That is The Education of Hyman Kaplan. Really, it's still great. It's really a great piece of work, really quite colorful character, but he writes it under a pseudonym because he thinks maybe he'll still have a shot at something academic. It's not working. He decides he's better as a comedy writer, or that's better for making a living. He goes to Hollywood, and he succeeds almost from the very beginning. That is, he's selling scripts, he's writing specs, he's getting paid for things that aren't even being made. He has a couple of films. One of them I'll say a little bit more about, but in some ways it's almost too easy. It's almost too easy. And he finds that he is missing the kind of work that he had done as a graduate student and as a scholar. So he decides he's going to start applying for grants to be able to write an academic history about the film industry while paying attention to this notion of the film industry and its role in the shaping of public opinion, although it was largely sort of an institutional history of the film industry as it was. as opposed to what happened to him as an academic in terms of trying to get a teaching job. He had great success getting funding for the research, great success, ends up publishing 2 substantial volumes. So in a lot of ways, it's really logical that he would be the major point person in directing the film program, because he is the major scholar of film at this point, or at least in many people's eyes, he would be the major scholar of film. But there's another story here, which I think is also really quite interesting in some ways, almost really difficult to talk about at this time. That is, the president, Franklin Roosevelt, was very adamant about hiring incredibly intelligent people, and he hired a lot of really good, thoughtful people from the academic world to be part of his cabinet. Again, people known as the Brain Trust, and if not part of the cabinet, sort of, they had various roles in the government. And one of them was a professor from the University of Chicago named Louis Brownlow, who happened to be one of the professors of Leo Rosten. So when Leo Rosten was a graduate student, his professor, Louis Brownlow, who FDR really just loved, and he was one of the most quiet people. He came from a more modest background. He really helped in getting the government into better shape. Well, through Brownlow, Leo Rosten came to know Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and their family extremely well. He became an intimate of the family, a real intimate of the family. So at the time when Roosevelt is really thinking hard about how to get the nation on board for the engagement of the country in the war in Europe at the time, that is, when England and France were fighting Nazi Germany, the person he turns to is Leo Rosten. It's Leo Rosten. Now, again, the United States is not yet in the war, and there are all sorts of reasons why this, say, few people have paid very much attention to it. But as one of the great points that I believe came first from my colleague Steve Carr, is that before the kind of work that was being done in World War II, it was thought that there should be very clear divisions between studio film, government film, instructional film, these different categories, and that the government should never engage in creating films that are going to be shown in theaters, that even if people aren't being charged for them, that is, when people are going to theaters and paying for things, that they would be seeing these as well. Well, one of the things that Rosten does, which I give him credit for in what I've written, is that he obliterates all of these boundaries. He completely obliterates these boundaries because he sees film itself as getting more political, which can't really be stopped, and wasn't necessarily a bad thing. But there are all kinds of reasons why these sorts of divisions would not be helpful in the way that film should be used at the time. So he is, as I said, he is the crucial figure, even though the person who comes in as the head of the program is Frank Capra. Okay, incredible. Why? All right, this is one of the very big issues. And it sounds, maybe sounds very strange to some people now, but Roosevelt was accused of being too cozy, both with Jews and with Hollywood. So one of the things that Rosten did was to make every effort to show that the war was not being fought for specific Jewish interests. And also, what he wanted to do was to make the kind of film work that was being done, with the exception of these big directors, as anonymous as possible. Because he knew, and Roosevelt knew, that so much of what really had to be done in the making of effective film was really going to be done in the end by Jewish guys. Okay, let me turn to another figure besides Rosten, someone who's almost completely forgotten, and that is a man named Donald Schlesinger. And he's older than Rosten. He was born in 1897. He died in 1977. He was a psychologist. He also wound up being the dean of the law school at the University of Chicago. He was really foundational for how psychology should be used in evaluating, say, witnesses and testimony. But he becomes, in 1938, the head of something called the American Film Center, which is really very vague. It probably was something that was almost always connected to government. So he was one of the people working most closely with Leo Rosten. And I won't go on for very much longer about him, but I do want to talk about one dimension of the work that these two did together, which really helped to set the mold. That is, there was a very, very long memo that was done, long letter that was done by Schlesinger to Leo Rosten. And the main point, and this was, again, quite detailed, something that I spend a lot of time on, he says, why should we reinvent the wheel? Why should we reinvent the wheel? The British have been at war since September 1939. They have a film program, which is going pretty well. There are also film programs in other parts of the British Empire. That is in Canada and Australia, and in England in particular, in the British Isles generally, it's sort of referred to as a celluloid circus. That is, and not circus in terms of acrobats and elephants, but like a circus as far as how you get from place to place. But among the major points that were made by Schlesinger, and also Rosten was connected to a lot of the people in Britain and well, among the major points that were made was that you really don't have to spend that much time thinking about censorship and who is, people maybe making movies that aren't going to fit with the war effort if the government controls the film stock. If the government has a very strict control on the film stock, in the same way, say that in Britain, newsprint was very tightly controlled. But the first lesson that they took from the British, which might sound really simple, but it isn't. It isn't simple. They said, have everything done in 35 and 16 millimeter. 35 and 16. Why? So it can be shown in theaters, and also so it can be shown in smaller places. Incredible. Really, really incredible suggestion. And then, again, this sounds really practical, but this is the kind of thing that Britain learned by trial and error. That is, they said, in showing the films, particularly the 16 millimeter versions, to the smaller audiences in different groups, make sure that anyone who's sent is really well trained in operating the projector, setting up the screen, being able to splice the film together if it breaks, to repair the bulb, and it also might help if the person can answer some questions. Again, it sounds really practical, it sounds really basic, but it helps a great deal if someone actually tells you about this. Okay, again, there are many, many other points, but related to content. In making movies, generally speaking, it's a lot easier to make a movie if you're making a version of something that already exists. So one of the things that Rosten and the whole film world wound up doing was they made American versions of British things. When I was growing up, one of the great sitcoms was All in the Family. Norman Lear's All in the Family. All in the Family had been more than inspired by a British TV show called Till Death Do Us Part. Again, a lot of this repeated itself over and over and over again in terms of how the world of film was conducted under Rosten. And to say a little bit more about how he operated, Rosten was adamant that everything be as clear as possible, that everything be clear, be clearly articulated, clearly presented, and to be very tangible in terms of explaining to, in the first instance, soldiers and then the general public, why the United States is at war and what it means. And it very often meant showing this kind of thing through maps or, telling it through stories, which was a kind of thing that that these Hollywood guys were really, really good with it. And say, one of the reasons why I wound up writing this book is that as I was watching these films, and a lot of them are lost, a huge number of these films are lost, I was struck by how good most of them were and how watchable they were, even when they were on like very either technical subjects or obscure subjects. It's really amazing how well film wound up working in this in this time period. Again, there's a lot written now about the Film Center in Astoria, Queens, and I talk about some of the figures who were active there who have not been given great attention, such as Jesse Lasky Jr., who went from there to the Pacific. Budd Schulberg was also very active in filmmaking, but the part that I talk about and really stress with Budd Schulberg is what happened with Schulberg in film at the end of the war. And I think I want to say just a little bit more about that. That is, we have a film that was primarily done, which thankfully one of Budd Schulberg's nieces, Sandra, was instrumental in sort of getting back out there. Sidney Bernstein in London was also had been involved in the making of this film. I realize I'm sort of jumping different generations here. That was actually Budd Schulberg's brother, Stuart. Budd Schulberg was really important in the world of film at the end of World War II in a different way. That is, for the Nuremberg trials, the decision was made to use film in order to make the case against the Nazis. And this was really the first time that this had ever been done in any kind of a judicial proceeding of this type. So what this means is that Budd Schulberg, with a team that was great and to whom he gave great credit, they saw just hours and hours and hours and hours and hours and hours of film in order to select what would be used in Nuremberg. But also, Budd Schulberg came up with something that wasn't followed through completely. That is, he really wanted the Nuremberg prosecutors to bring charges against those who had been active and complicit in the Nazi film world. And he came up with a rather incredible report making suggestions about who should really be pursued. But the person who he saw is really most important for going after who he would have liked to have seen prosecuted, but at the very least to be guaranteed that she would not be able to continue as a filmmaker was Leni Riefenstahl. And it was actually Budd Schulberg, more than any other figure, who really tracked her down, seriously spoke to her in a type of interrogation where he was not, say, completely forthcoming about exactly the kind of role that he was playing. He actually approached her saying that he was wanted more information about her filmmaking, and actually some of the films themselves that they didn't have in their possession. And she spoke to him for quite a long time. And his experience with her appeared in the form of a couple of different articles, but rather remarkably, she, in just talking about what she did and in trying to explain her innocence, just dug herself into a hole that was deeper and deeper and deeper. And also in speaking to Schulberg, she was the one who raised the issue of anti-Semitism and concentration camps, and wound up contradicting herself quite badly. And I don't think I'll ever be able to prove this, but I strongly suspect that Budd Schulberg was instrumental in helping to get her assets frozen, which means that she was never able again to direct a major film. Again, she lived a long life. She continued to work in different ways. She actually turned to photography, and there are some people who had all sorts of nice things to say about that. But I think Schulberg was completely correct in seeing her as one of the most important accomplices of Hitler, and in some ways continuing the thread of Rosten in terms of how public opinion was shaped in Nazi Germany. But in the same way that the prosecution of Nazi war criminals was very selective, and only a very small percent of those who could be deemed war criminals wound up being officially prosecuted, the United States government and the International Tribunal did not follow through with Schulberg's suggestions with what should be done with the Nazi film world. But I still think it's a really interesting story. It was a really interesting attempt. But one of the things that Schulberg was after, and this is something I would like to tie back to Leo Rosten and these other figures. Schulberg tried really, really hard to find a film that he had heard of that was specifically done of atrocities against Jews and of the genocide of Jews in concentration camps, and he never found it. He never found explicitly what he was looking for, and he tried very, very hard. He actually worked sort of surprisingly well with his Soviet counterparts, in part because one of his colleagues turned out to be one of the great Soviet experts on film, who was absolutely crazy about the director John Ford. He said John Ford is sort of one word, and so this was one of the few instances where there was actually really great collaboration, but he didn't quite find what he was able to find. But one of the things that's really rather remarkable is that Schulberg was very, very focused on what had happened to the Jews being seen as central to the crimes against humanity as were perpetrated by the Nazis. Okay, now to get back to Ross and these other figures. I think one of the reasons why there was almost nothing said or written about Rosten and his cohort is because a difficult question might have been raised because of the way that things changed over time. And that is, if it was better known that Leo Rosten and Leonard Spiegelglass and Julian Blaustein and Daniel Teradash and Bernie Fines and all these other people I talk about. And there's one other name I do want to mention here, which I'll sort of put in a little bit later, Jules Buck, an incredible figure who worked with John Huston, incredible cinematographer. I'll say a little bit more about him too, but I'll talk about how he fits into this picture. Okay. If it was asked, why didn't you say anything about what was happening to the Jews? And of course, we wouldn't have the term Holocaust until later. They wouldn't have had an answer that would have satisfied a lot of people. But I believe they did have a good answer. That is, their main focus was keeping the United States together. The United States was much more fragile. The United States was much more divided even after Pearl Harbor than say people gave credit for generally. There's been quite a bit of scholarly work done on this. I think, wow, it was really important that their focus was on keeping the United States together. And they did address anti-Semitism. They did address racism in a lot of different contexts. So I think that this is something that they should not be seen as guilty of. Also, really important, I didn't find any evidence that the kind of filmic work that you would need to build a story around was ever suppressed. That is, they didn't seem to have anything where they could have really hung this story on it, even though there were those who were saying, hey, why, particularly to Rosten, why aren't you talking about the fate of the Jews? Okay, really problematic, something I've spent a fair amount of time talking about, but there is another sort of dark side to it. Rosten and Spiegelglass and much more famously, Budd Schulberg, not so great when we get to the Red Scare after the Second World War. And not only not so great in general, but one of the reasons why Rosten in particular, I think, sort of doesn't come out very well in this is because he particularly appealed to filmmakers of the left in order to try to explain and show Americans why it was a good thing that they were allied to the Soviet Union. And they needed filmmakers who knew the world of Russia and communism in the Soviet Union. And really rather extraordinary. And they didn't. This is where they sort of fell off. Okay, mention Jules Buck. Jules Buck, incredible cinematographer. His daughter, Joan Juliet Buck, who might be on listening here, I'm very appreciative. She showed me incredible materials. The shooting script of the Battle of San Pietro was not just in the handwriting of John Huston, it's also in the handwriting of Jules Buck, amazing figure. Jules Buck could not continue to live in Hollywood with the Red Scare. And there were those who were driven out explicitly, of course, those who were hounded, those whose careers were ruined, the kind of culture wars atmosphere that wound up being created was truly horrible. And there are lots of interesting individual cases that come out of this, but in light of this, wow, Rosten is not heroic. He's not heroic. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew what these filmmakers had done during the war, and he did not step forward and say, hey, I was a person who tried to hire them. So it's a very mixed bag. But I think the last thing that I'll say is that the kind of film work that was done, and Rosten wasn't a great scriptwriter. He wasn't a great film. He wasn't a great movie guy. He was a great critic, though. And he had a very sharp mind for how to get things done. And he was the person, I think, more than anyone else, who came up with a couple of ideas that wound up being crucial. First of all, obliterate the boundaries between what the government can and can't do in filmmaking. And he also is the person who came up with the idea relatively early. Let's get Hollywood people, put them into government in their profession as filmmakers, and give them a rank. Give them a rank. Give them authority in the very beginning. Bring them into the government. Bring them into the army. We need them to do what they do, and what they wound up being produced was incredible. And not these 5 great directors were absolutely great, but the kind of work that was done, the depth and the breadth and the number of films, wow, was it a lot of people doing this work, and they should be given great credit. But there's credit that is due to a huge number of other figures. And the very last thing I'll say is that, in a good way, Roosevelt knew that he himself could not get into the kishkas of Hollywood in order to have film help him to get America on board, particularly in Europe, without having some of these inside Hollywood Jews. And I think he loved Leo Rosten. He loved Leo Rosten. This was really quite incredible, but it would be basically an unspoken story, except for one piece of writing of Rosten's. Okay, I think I'll leave it there. Lisa, please come back. And I'm happy to answer some questions. And I'm sorry for not showing some film, but I'm happy to suggest some things that people might see. But I really wanted to spend some time for your audience, in particular, talking about Rosten and what he did during the war that was so crucial. And thank you very much for giving me a chance to talk about it.
Incredibly interesting. So thank you, Michael. So we'll jump right in. Was the main focus of the OWI to disseminate propaganda to the Americans or our enemies?
Okay, this is it was to Americans, but with the notion that our friends and enemies are listening. So it's really rather complicated, because say these countries are very aware of what they're saying. And to give just one other example, one of the more interesting things I found in the papers of Budd Schulberg, and my thanks to dear colleague Susanna Heschel at Dartmouth. I had the chance to work in Budd Schulberg's papers at Dartmouth. He was a Dartmouth graduate, as was a Walter Wanger, Rhymes with Danger, great figure, wonderful book on him by Matt Bernstein. But he actually saved one of the long Nazi reviews of What Made Sammy Run. What Made Sammy Run was like great Hollywood, anti-Hollywood novel about this sort of sleazy figure in Hollywood who really makes his way by stepping on other people and doing all sorts of nasty. Still a great book. What Makes Sammy Run is incredible. But of course, what the Nazis said was, oh, this proves that everything we've been saying about the Jews is absolutely true. So one of the things that one finds is, in terms of how what we could call propaganda works, is wow, it bounces all over the place. It's appropriated, it's misappropriated, it's used in all sorts of different ways. And say kinds of things the Nazis were saying were used against Roosevelt by all sorts of opponents of his. All sorts of anti-Semitic arguments were were interwoven. But so again, OWI, say officially, this is for the Office of War Information for the United States. But again, it served a larger function. And there's also, say, ways that it's connected to other organizations as well. And again, there's really good work. And I'm gonna say, I really, as much as I'm happy to say not nice things about all sorts of people and books, whatever, but there's a good reason why most of my colleagues didn't get this. A lot of the material I found at the National Archives had actually been classified until relatively recently. That is, a lot of it was unclassified at different dates. I really should have kept better record of exactly when. So while I'm not saying that, oh, gee, everybody missed this great story that I got. There are really good reasons for it. And also, Rosten tried very hard to make sure that it wouldn't be easy to find the kind of story that I've told.
Well, then I can fold two questions into
Sure.
that last comment, which the first is, did Rosten acknowledge this work? And then secondly, were you surprised how this story evolved as you researched and wrote the book?
Okay, first of all, I was not only surprised, but I was sort of shocked at how important he was and sort of how little this had been noticed. But part of it, he was really, really crafty. And one of the ways he was really crafty is two of the people who are most important in the world of film are people nobody would ever know. That is Nelson Pointer and Lowell Mellett, who were basically newspaper guys who Rosten knew from his PhD doing this stuff on the Washington Correspondent. Is really it's really quite incredible. Okay, he did talk about it a little bit. There was one story, though, where it wasn't so much about the film work, but there was one story he wrote about him taking part. He's in this committee in London where he was paired with sort of a British official, and the British official he happened to be paired with was actually the husband of the father of the Queen Mother, David Bowes-Lyon. Okay, so this is 1942, and they know that the Nazis are going to make a really big deal about January 30th, 1943, which is the 10th anniversary of when they've seized power. And Rosten comes up with the idea, and they know, oh, there's going to be, big radio dress, and it's set for 11 a.m. when the Nazis claim that they actually seized power. It's all sorts of other anniversaries that the Nazis are doing. And he comes up with the idea of why don't we bomb them exactly at the moment they're going on air to give their great radio addresses about the anniversary and the greatness of Nazism. Why was this unusual? At that point, it was only night bombing. This would have been the first day bombing, and the bombing was being done by Britain. So he had to appeal to his colleague to do this. And also, he knew that it was FDR's birthday. That is, he knew that January 30th was the birthday of the president, and he raised this. And at first, his colleagues said, sort of typical mumble, in the wonderful British way. And then the next day, his counterpart comes into his office and says, "We'll do it." And wow, this happened. It turned out to be quite a story in a number of different ways, but this is sort of the fullest story that he tells about what he did. And then a couple of points, one was at Columbia, and then there were a couple of others afterwards where he was part of interview panels about what he did during the war. But it's weird, he was never completely honest about exactly when he was hired or how he came in. But the best that we can figure, he was actually hired in the spring of 1940 by Roosevelt. And one of the things he says, which I think is really rather amazing, is that he learned when he was hired by Roosevelt at the time of the fall of France. Roosevelt said he could never live with Hitler being in control of France, that would never be acceptable. We will never do business the way that Hitler wants to do business, and also the belief that Britain should be defended. So according to Rosten, this actually happens quite early. So he talks about what he did at a couple of different points, but there's only one place where this exists, at Columbia, and dear student Sam Sheldon actually got the transcript for me. The recordings and the transcript don't match 100%. Not all of them have everything, but it's really good. So maybe he talked about it explicitly in just a couple of different places, never really wrote about it. As I said, for all sorts of reasons, he kept this buried, as it seemed that it was these other people who were really crucial, but I found that others, including Harpo Marx, played quite a big role in the shaping of film policy.
There are a few people asking about FDR. How does FDR's having been seen in some quarters as too friendly towards Jew reconcile with criticism for having turned away a ship bringing Jewish refugees from Europe? And then another one, expand upon Roosevelt being seen as too chummy with Jews.
Okay, this was actually a very large part, and I realize there are all kinds of contradictions and all sorts of figures. There are things that are very inconsistent. But one of my epigraphs of the book is Mrs. Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was a very big figure in all of this as well. And in that case, wow, there isn't much that is contradictory. There isn't much that is unequivocal. That is, she was, in terms of almost anything that was good that was being done from the perspective of refugees, plight of Jews, that is, she was really an important figure. But I think that as far as Roosevelt Roosevelt was definitely of the belief, and I think that, something I don't want to begin to get into here is this issue of rescue, but I think if Roosevelt had been able to, he would have opened up a second front. That is, that as much as there are all sorts of reasons why it didn't happen until June 6, 1944, Roosevelt was really itching to open another major front much earlier. Good reasons why Churchill didn't want to do it. They were really threatened, but that's what really would have changed things for the Jews of Europe. That is, if the whole course of the war had gone differently, with, say, the United States being much more sort of actively involved, and again, very understandable, it was a difficult relationship between the Allies, between the Americans and Britain, say the negotiations leading up to D-Day, and there are a lot very good reasons why it took as long as it did. But to the extent that I can find that the guys I worked on had any sort of ideological view, is they all seemed very willing and open on this idea of an earlier front, on an earlier, additional big front. I was, history of the war, Second World War. It's a world war. It's amazingly complicated. But I think that a lot of the film work that was being done, like I said, was anti-Semitic. It was sort of anti-racist. Some of it was actually sort of surprisingly friendly to women doing all kinds of things, handicapped people, the blind. Really, really rather extraordinary. But I think that the issue of immigration had basically, in large part, been closed in 1924 with the Johnson Acts, in terms of most of America saying, we really don't want more immigrants coming from you. So again, this is very problematic, but I think the main point that I want to make from the perspective of the Hollywood guys is Roosevelt wanted to get into the war in Europe. He wanted to get in earlier than Pearl Harbor. He wanted to get in a more sort of even stronger way but you have to remember, in the United States, you have a Congress. This is not something that the president doesn't say. His personal relations as opposed to policy, and even say some things that were done at the State Department. You have to remember that there were lots of people in the government who were not in sync with Roosevelt himself. And things were really divided. But from the perspective of what I'm talking about here with Hollywood, wow, he was incredibly close to these people. And say Jules Buck was one of them too. That is, he was amazingly close to the family. And I think that when he talked about it later in his life, people thought, what is this guy talking about? It was completely true. If anything, it was understated compared to the significance of these kind of personal relationships.
I'm going to make this the last question.
Sure.
And thank you all for great questions that keep rolling in. But it'd be great to get this in. What films do you recommend watching?
Okay. My father's favorite film. It's actually a post-war film, but it was built on a film that was done during wartime. That is The Best Years of Our Lives by William Wyler. If you haven't seen it, absolutely incredible film about 4 servicemen who return to a sort of unnamed, possibly Midwestern city. And Jew never appears in the film, but wow, there are reasons. I think when one sees it, you'll see why this was really, really significant for understanding how soldiers would have appreciated this, and also how Jews would have appreciated it. But William Wyler is great, but it wouldn't have existed as it existed as a film without the film that was done earlier by Julian Blaustein, who almost nobody remembers. And he actually found his figure, Harold Russell, whose hands had actually been, blown off, had been blown off during the war. So I think that's absolutely incredible. But I'd say the Why We Fight series. The Why We Fight series is incredible. And if people want to ask me, I can recommend some particular segments. It really is worth watching. It's really tremendous. And the segment of Prelude to War is incredible. It's incredible, as are so many other pieces, and there are lots of short films I could recommend. But I think lots and lots of great films, like some of them that George Cukor did, are gone. We can't find them, just completely missing. And loads of other things are missing too. But just absolutely great stuff. And sadly, some of it disappears on YouTube. But it is possible to find a fair amount of it. And Library of Congress or YouTube, you can definitely find. But Best Years of Our Lives, I'd say, as far as feature. And also Casablanca, and our dear colleague Noah Eisenberg wrote a fabulous book about Casablanca, and this is sort of interwoven into this as well. Again, it's, I think, one of the best books that exist about a great film that anyone could ever imagine, and it deals really well with the war and refugees and why censorship was really not that big an issue for these figures.
Michael, thank you so much. For all of you out there, Hollywood's Unofficial Film Corp.
Oh, miss, one last thing though. If you want to purchase the book from University of Wisconsin Press, AA254, you'll get a big discount.
Thank you. And I think after reading the book, it's safe to say you will bring a whole different understanding and context to watching some of these movies. So thank you again for taking time to join us today, for writing the book, and for all of your scholarly work. I hope to see you back here again soon.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank our producer, Elizabeth Carteropoli, for all of her work behind the scenes, which always makes things run smoothly. And a big thanks to all of our members whose support makes all of our ongoing work possible. I encourage you to visit yiddishbookcenter.org/donate, where you can renew your membership, give a gift membership, or learn how you can become a sustaining giver and provide support for all of these ongoing programs which you watch, as well as all of our other work across the organization. I hope that you will join us this coming Thursday, February 20th at 7 p.m. when we present Lit Vox in Love, a conversation with Professor David G. Roskis. To see our full calendar of events and to register for our public programs, visit yiddishbookcenter.org. www.unofficial.org/events. Until next time, stay strong, stay healthy, and stay in touch. Thanks again for joining us.